Good morning, Comrade. You listen to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. This is your weekly Good Morning, Comrade. Jeff here with a very special interview. I guess it's been the last time we had Eric Blanc on the show was probably, I think, like episode 3 when we were just starting the show. And now he's finally back. He's got a brand new book coming out called Organize Your We Are the Union, I beg your pardon. How worker-to-worker organizing is revitalizing labor and winning big. Eric is an assistant professor of labor studies at Rutgers University, and he's a organizer at EWOC, the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee. Welcome back to Good Morning, Comrade, Eric Blanc. How you doing, buddy?
Good. Thanks for having me back on.
Totally. And yeah, man, just really good to talk to you again. And we are going to talk a little bit about your book that is forthcoming. We Are the Union. Let's talk about it. Give us the rundown.
Yeah. So the basic message of the book is that you can and should organize your workplace. You know, in some ways it's that simple. There's a lot more to it, and there's a lot of argumentation. But the basic message really is to look at the lessons of the recent labor uptick. You know, think about the Starbucks campaign, the Amazon workers who won their union, the auto workers who won, the first factory in the South. What this has shown, I argue in the book, is that it's possible and necessary to do a new model of labor organizing in which workers sort of take the lead and take on a lot of the responsibilities that in the past were done by full-time paid union staffers. A lot of these responsibilities now are taken on by workers themselves, whether it's initiating a campaign, whether it's training other workers at your company, whether it's strategizing about the way forward. What's been so beautiful about the recent years is that workers have done this, and it shows that that is a model that's not only powerful, they've won huge wins, but it's scalable. You can organize millions of workers that way in a way you can't do that when you have to rely on a really cost-intensive, staff-heavy approach.
No, so what you're saying is that in this sort of situation, or this way that you have it sort of laid out, that essentially a member-driven organizing with staff support, as opposed to sort of a more, I guess you could say, staff-based model where there's the sort of like nexus of a lot of things. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. And my argument, and as I think you sort of suggest there, isn't that you don't need staff. I think staff and resources are crucial. The problem is that in the traditional labor organizing model, you need for a new campaign. So if you're trying to unionize new workers, the norm for like best practice is you need one staffer for every 100 workers you're targeting. Like that's more or less what's been accepted wisdom for decades. And that actually can be really effective. You know, so good labor organizing, if you have a good staffer and well-resourced along that model, can make huge gains, can be very powerful. The problem is just you can't win the war that way. You can win battles, but in order to organize millions and millions of workers, that's just not a scalable model. There's not enough staffers. There's not enough money. So you have to find ways to do the types of things that staffers normally do, but let workers and inspire workers to do them.
And you sort of back that up with a quote by Shawn Fain, who is the president of United Auto Workers. He came into the charge of UAW probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and was one of the people that, you know, he was the leader during the stand-up strike nationwide a while ago. And they've also been really a lot of countless campaigns that UAW has sort of driven members towards, including things like EV battery facilities and various others, Mercedes and Tennessee and Alabama. He has this quote, you won't win by telling workers what to do, what to say, or how to say it. We win by giving working class people the tools, the inspiration, and the courage to stand up for themselves. And that's sort of like the idea of it. Like the idea is to essentially encourage workers and provide the support for the workers themselves to organize their unions, and that's sort of the role that you're sort of describing.
Yeah, that's right. And the auto workers are shown that it's possible not only in higher ed and grad schools or amongst certain sort of college educated workers, but it's also true amongst blue collar workers, including blue collar workers in the South. So yeah, I think this is a sort of generalizable and powerful model, and I hope it'll continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned the importance of unions. There was a graph in the sort of excerpt that I used to prepare for this that I remember probably about 5 or 6 years ago when you came down to New Orleans for a conversation that we had about your previous book, Red State Revolt. And it's this chart that shows the union density sort of juxtaposed with the top 10%'s income share. And you could sort of see when union density is up, the amount of money and amount of the share of income of the entire economy that the wealthiest 10% have comes down. And just, as a result of that, the amount of the share that goes to actually to workers goes up. And then you sort of see they divide apart almost like 1-to-1 when you have union density sliding down, which it has been doing since probably the 1950s. And really kind of dropping in the 1970s. Those two things really diverge. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the graph of all graphs to explain what the crisis is in this country and in most countries of the world. Like, this is just the pattern is that income inequality, which is sort of an indicator actually just for this broader inequality that we see in which, the rich and the corporations are taking more and more and more of the power and the economic control and the political control. So this is sort of a stand-in for that. We've seen that skyrocket directly, and it's not just a correlation; it's a causation. As union decline continues, then the rich get richer, right? And so when they say rich get richer, the poor get poorer, that's really true. But it's specific that the union movement is the way ordinary working people of all races, backgrounds, regions, whatever, are able to push back against that tendency. And the amazing thing is it works, right? Which is why companies are doing everything always to destroy and prevent unions, because unions really are that powerful. Unions are the single main mechanism through which ordinary people can challenge the control and power of the corporate elite. And so the crucial task, I think, and then this is sort of why I wrote the book and all the organizing we do through the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, is to turn that graph around, right? How do we make it so that millions of more workers every year are joining unions, so they have that power, so they have that sense of solidarity? And that's crucial not just for combating economic inequality, but it's crucial for essentially changing all of the things that we need to see change, whether it's climate disaster prevention, whether it's racial justice, whether it's ending the military funding of sort of imperialist genocide abroad. All of these things require working people to have more power, and we just don't have that power right now, and unions are the way to get that power.
Yeah, and that's really important too, because I mean, when you have this sort of situation where working people are so disempowered, they have absolutely no way to. I mean, do you think that disempowered workers who have no ability to organize amongst themselves, not even in their workplace, are they going to be able to express political power in any coherent way? Absolutely not. I mean, it's sort of a prerequisite to expressing any kind of power over what you were mentioning, the broader inequality and the sort of broader imperialism that the American state does, in order to even sort of start getting that coherence together. You need to be organizing people at the place where they have the most commonality, which is the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think politics is really important. I was like a labor organizer for the Bernie campaign, and I think that labor organizing and sort of left-wing politics go hand in hand. That being said, I think we've seen the real limitations over the last 5 years or more. Really, what are we in? Almost 10 years or more. Jeez, yeah. Again, 2016. Bernie, 2016. It's almost 10 years now. So we've seen the limitations of sort of a robust electoral approach. The electoral left in many ways for all these years has gone further than the labor movement. As far as the Bernie campaign in particular, really galvanized tens of millions of people. But we saw that Bernie wasn't able to win. And then we also saw that the Democratic Party has retreated from its, modest but, real concessions to labor. We can talk about that later. It made some good moves under the Biden administration to support unions more, but it's already retreating from that and sort of in full-on crisis. And moreover, Trump somehow has managed to paint himself as the only person who understands the pain of working people, because the Democratic Party has ignored them. And all of these political limitations, whether it's of the left or of the Democratic Party, then I think are deeply rooted in just the lack of power of ordinary people and the lack of power of the labor movement. So part of that is the labor movement itself, if it were stronger, would be in a far better position to impose upon like the Democratic Party, but even to a certain extent the Republicans, a different agenda. And similarly, working people of all backgrounds, when they have the experience of solidarity and being organized with their coworkers, are far less likely to look for scapegoats, because people are angry, people are in a lot of pain, people are trying to make sense of all of the sort of crises in the world. And Trump and the Republicans have provided a clear answer to that and sort of acknowledged the pain and provided a culprit. And the Democrats showed no signs of even attempting to really do that. So it's really incumbent upon the labor movement and the left more generally, but I think the labor movement has a broader appeal at this point, to take up the mantle and explain, like, there are very good reasons why your life is not how it should be. And the primary reason for that is that billionaires and corporations are profiting off of you and they don't care about you. And the only thing that will turn around is for us to organize as working people. And so that's a very important message that needs to get out there. And the labor movement has the responsibility to get it out there to millions and tens of millions.
Totally. And you've been in the leftist spaces where people are talking about, oh, we're going to do this or that model, or this version of events are going to be how we completely take over the, political system or whatever. And I'm like, y'all are talking about something that is so far removed from like what is actually necessary to even get into the position to even start having those conversations, where the cart is so far before the horse you can't even see it. Any kind of serious potential political movement really does need to have a base of people that are at least to some extent organized. And again, that one common place that people are able to do that is the shop floor, is their workplaces.
Yeah, I think that's crucial, because there's a few things going on. One is there's a tendency of a lot of leftists, particularly online, to sort of raise the most radical demands and to raise the most radical perspectives and to sort of out radicalize other people.
Yeah, it's true. I don't want to be like speak negatively of anybody, but I say that tendency is something that is deeply paralyzing to any kind of actual political motion.
Right. And I would love to see a communist future. You know what I mean? Like, I think that'd be great. I would love to see a general strike in this country, and I organized to support that. And, hopefully that can happen a lot sooner than we get to full communism. But the question I always pose to people who raise that as like the perspective is, well, okay, what would it take to get there? And are you actually getting us in that direction? If you aren't able to talk to your coworker who is like apolitical, or maybe a Republican, or maybe a liberal, and can you talk to them about coming to a meeting with your coworkers to talk about asking for a raise? Can you get them to sign a petition to your management asking them to, give you all better health benefits, right? If you can't have conversations with people who don't already agree with you, you're not going to get any of these other things. And essentially what organizing is fundamentally about winning over people who think they don't agree with you, who don't agree with you, and building a sort of new common sense and new collective structure with them. And so I think we need that outwards facing ethos. And I would say that ethos is also important against the kind of doom and gloom vibe.
Another deeply paralyzing tendency.
Yeah, which is really probably much more pervasive. Who knows amongst your listeners? I'm not sure, but
we try and keep it positive over here. But we realize the overarching sort of like tendencies, or
but the overall vibe post Trump in particular, and it's understandable particularly after over a year of genocide of Palestinians and Trump's reelection and climate disasters. It's easy for people to feel just despair and to want to check out. I've had so many people tell me oh, I just want to go into political hibernation for 4 years, like wake me up when this is over. The problem with that is that that's exactly what Trump and the billionaires want you to do, right? And the organizing that the left and the labor movement is doing is even more urgent now that sort of the oligarchy is sort of nakedly in power. And then second, it's just not true. It's just not true that just because Trump's in power, there's nothing we can do. And like the most we can hope for is to wake up in 4 years and then start over. You know, working people have a tremendous amount of power. Even when there's Republicans in office. You know, I did some research with a fellow sort of labor leftist named guy, Chris Bonner, and we found that actually more workers unionized under the Bush administration in the early 2000s than under Obama, because unions were still funding new organizing then. So there isn't a direct inevitable correlation between bad Republicans in office and the labor movement going into decline. It makes it harder in some ways, but it also opens up opportunities because sort of the nakedness of the sort of class structure is put on display when you have Trump was just yesterday surrounded by the richest people in the world. You know, it's just like, okay, like the enemy is sort of showing who it is, and it's up to us to say, yeah, they are the enemy, but they can be defeated. Like Amazon won't function without its workers. Starbucks won't function without its workers. No public institution, the government can't function without its federal workers, right? And so we need to be able to tap that power. We need to be able to show that working people are not just going to lie down and accept all of this without fight back. And I expect that there will be a fight back, and we should sort of orient towards that.
Yeah, you're listening to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. Eric Blanc is our guest. He is the author of We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing and Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big. You mentioned a couple of things that I wanted to sort of like drill down on a little bit. And you mentioned this sort of like the tendency right now, or the situation we're in right now, where the ruling class has probably been more distilled and visible than at any point in either of our lives. You can look at, you know, like you mentioned at the Trump inauguration, which happened recently, and point to like the 3 or 4 richest guys on earth standing right behind the president of the United States, and they're all essentially like right there, and you can very easily identify who the class enemies are. And that's, you know, while there are, you know, a lot of issues and a lot of sort of, like you mentioned, prevailing sort of doomerism about this sense, at the very least, the enemy is showing itself, and there is a way that we can sort of respond to that, a way to turn a lot of this, you know, how do I say this? This like animosity, or a lot of this sort of like upheaval that workers are genuinely experiencing right now, no matter what the Biden administration will tell you about being the greatest, you know, the greatest for the economy since sliced bread or whatever. Like there is a very real sense that people are unhappy. There's an opportunity to identify the enemy and say, like, this is how we get them, and the way that we get them is by organizing in our workplaces, and that's how we build the political power to combat them.
Yeah, and Trump's playing with fire by talking economic populist talk. You know, this is a tricky thing, and in some ways it's scary because, well, for obvious reasons, you know, Trump's agenda is very reactionary, and for him to be able to sort of win the support of some working people is a very bad political development. On the other hand, it has this contradictory impact of raising expectations amongst working people that their demands are going to get listened to. And so there's this huge contradiction with the Trump administration, which on the one hand is like framing itself as a defender of working people, and on the other hand is just openly basking in the sort of billionaire class and unashamedly starting to.
They were literally on a Twitter space, Trump and Elon several months ago, talking about, oh yeah, I really love how Amazon was firing the workers that were organizing their union, like for God and everybody else to hear. You know what I mean?
Right. And, you know, unions are extremely popular still. So this is another reason not to be overly pessimistic, is that the last 4 years of labor sort of uptick hasn't just gone away. It's there. What becomes of it remains to be seen, and it depends in part on like what listeners to this podcast and, you know, other people across the country do. But there is this contradiction between Trump's promises on a sort of economic populism and the reality of what his agenda will be. And that creates a huge amount of space for the labor movement in particular to say, okay, like now is the time. Now is the time after years of inflation. Working people deserve a raise. Working people deserve much better. Trump, you promised that we're going to organize to like make sure it happens. The companies need to meet the basic living standards of working people in this country. And so I think that there's a big opportunity. Whether the labor movement seizes it is a very different question, because the overall sort of practice has been very defensive and risk averse and sort of narrowly focused. But the opportunity is there.
Yeah, and I mean, you already are seeing some of the, and again, there's been a lot of hay made, especially on the left, about the president of the Teamsters, Sean O'Brien, like doing these sort of I don't know, these allusions to like working with the Trump administration. And again, this is established labor. This isn't working people necessarily in their workplaces. This is labor leaders, right? But they're essentially positioning themselves so that if the administration attacks them, they're essentially saying that they're positioning themselves so that they can make the case that that they tried the easy way and that the administration is choosing the hard way to a certain extent. And there's also been, I believe it was Sean Fain said a day or two ago as a recording that he was willing to work with the administration, not necessarily because of, agreement with it or whatever, but it's just like one of those things that kind of has to happen. You have to sort of like give a little bit of an opportunity for them to discredit themselves.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a bad thing, frankly, for the labor movement to assert its independence from the Democrats more. And I think it's good to make demands on both parties. The question is how you do that. Do you do that in a way that covers up the actual policies of these, that papers over, that's where it gets tricky territory, where, you pretend the people you're looking to are something other than they are. That doesn't preclude, though, the saying, if Trump is serious, he should do this. If the Trump administration is serious about supporting working people, they should reform labor law. Things like this. And there's some talk of it. I think it's very shallow and thin. I don't think there's any there. I think the fact that the Trump administration booted out the pro-union NLRB, right? They refused to continue a pro-union NLRB. I think this gives us a very clear sense of where they're headed on the issues of working people. But nevertheless, there's no problem with it. And if it often is necessary to call people's bluff, say, okay, if you're serious, do this. And I think that's the spirit which the UAW, and I think even the Teamsters to a certain extent, are coming at it.
I mean, yeah, you're definitely right from the perspective of like the Democrats are not doing us a whole lot of favors, by creating the working conditions any better either. It was just a incident not long ago that was the Democrats had an opportunity to essentially at least protect the NLRB's labor friendly majority for a couple of years, and they did a bunch of political BS where they failed to do that. And it's like, yeah, none of these, high, like national level political parties are actually our allies in any of this stuff. It's the workers versus the bosses straight up. And we can't count on any of these political leaders necessarily. Obviously, there are strategic situations where we can engage to push our agenda forward. But I mean, if we're relying on them as a key part of our strategy moving forward, that is a dead letter straight up.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just interesting. I think that the proof is in the pudding. The Democrats, lost against a very unpopular politician like Trump, and a lot of working people saw Trump as the lesser evil, essentially. And so this poses a real dilemma for unions, because the unions for decades now have oriented primarily towards trying to work with the Democrats and hope that the Democrats sort of deliver salvation from above. And just not only has that not worked to sort of stave off Trumpism, but there's no immediate future for this perspective. I mean, whether it's 4 years or 8 years, we don't know how long Trump's going to be there. And frankly, the Democratic brand is so tainted in so many parts of the country that unions sort of just being seen as appendages of the Democratic Party is a losing strategy, even just on purely defensive immediate grounds, in a way that maybe wasn't true 5, 10, 20 years ago, but it is true now. And so unless labor unions are able and willing to assert their independence, not just politically, oh, that's part of it, but by asserting their independence in practice, by organizing new workers, by taking their lead from rank and file workers, by orienting towards bottom-up struggle, then rather than orienting towards sort of like schmoozing it up in state capitals and in the White House. If unions can't do that, then it's hard to see what their sort of recipe for revitalization will be.
Mm-hmm. And so you just sort of to circle back to your book, you mentioned that there are 3 cases. This is in the coming from your book. There's 3 cases of worker-to-worker wins that are good sort of case studies to look at as we move forward. Do you want to talk a little bit about which of these things have been working? How workers have been winning? You mentioned Starbucks earlier. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. And so I actually give a lot of different sort of case studies in the book. Starbucks is one of them. And maybe it's actually worth starting there because the Starbucks campaign has, in some ways, it's just massive. They've organized over 500 stores, over 10,000 workers. They've won huge concessions from the company. They forced the company to the bargaining table, although they don't have a first contract yet. But that's not that surprising because it takes a lot of time to bring a huge company and
the company is busting out every old dirty trick in the book to slow it down, to stop it, and everything.
But the movement's still there, and they're not going away. And so the book looks at the Starbucks campaign as one of the case studies, and says, okay, well, how did they get this far? What did they do? And what are the lessons from this that could be replicated? And so one thing that proved really crucial, is just worth flagging, and I mentioned it briefly before, is workers were training other workers. And that was crucial for it spreading so rapidly and so widely, because listeners might remember it was in Buffalo, New York in late 2021 that workers at just one store in Buffalo, New York won a union election. And they, at that time, had no plans to do a national campaign. They initially were just focused locally and weren't even trying to sort of unionize Starbucks on a nationwide level. But the amount of attention that their struggle got meant that all of a sudden you had hundreds and eventually thousands of workers across the country reaching out to them. And so this posed this dilemma, whereas if it had been a traditional union campaign, they would have actually just stuck with the initial plan. They would have focused locally because they didn't have the resources or staff to try to all of a sudden go national against this massive company, the 6th largest private employer in the US. But instead, they took a worker-to-worker approach and just said, okay, we don't have the staff, but we're going to ask the workers who helped organize their shops in Buffalo to talk to workers across the country. So they got on Zoom. As a parenthesis, part of the reason you're able to see this type of sort of wide-scale bottom-up organizing is that digital tools do make it easier for workers to take on more of this lead. And so what that looked like, in this case of Starbucks, is that workers who won their union election in Buffalo all of a sudden started talking over Zoom all day, every day for weeks to workers across the country who are reaching out and saying, how did you win at your store? How did you do it? And they talked to them. And so it was possible then for workers to train workers effectively in the sort of tools of the trade, as it were, for what it takes to win. So that's, I think, one really crucial thing about this new model is that workers are talking to other workers and not just farming out that role to staff. And then another example I sort of pinpoint in the book is the News Guild. The News Guild, for listeners who don't know, is the union or one of the unions of writers, journalists, and they've won extremely hard battles over recent years. Think about the crisis in the media industry. A lot of these companies are getting bought by hedge funds and are just getting totally downsized. And partly in response to this, journalists have unionized in very large numbers. Again, it was workers talking to other workers. It was workers taking on all of the responsibilities that are normally done by staff and winning big. And they've gone up against some of the biggest companies in the media industry, and they've won really, really hard battles. And they have, I think, maybe the most developed member-to-member, worker-to-worker organizing approach in the country because they've been doing it for longer. This organizing goes back to 2017, 2018. They have a thing called the Member Organizing Program, in which any rank and file worker who wants to and who's sort of shown their willingness and ability to try to organize joins this program to learn all of the skills that traditionally you would only teach to a staffer, whether it's like how to run a meeting, how to launch a campaign, how to train another campaign, how to do XYZ. Every one of these skills via these mass online trainings and via smaller worker-to-worker chats that they call pods have skilled up hundreds and hundreds of worker leaders who've been able then to win big fights all across the country in really hard conditions. So I think those are two really good examples of what I'm talking about. And we've seen it in other industries, as I mentioned before. We've seen it in auto, we've seen it in a slew of other industries. But I think those are two of the more maybe high profile examples.
Yeah. You are listening to WHIV-LP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. Eric Blanc is our guest today. He is the author of We Are the Union. And we're talking just a little bit about how workers can, essentially take ownership over their own organizing situations and how we can build worker power nationwide. So really, again, thanks again for joining us, Eric. You mentioned the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee. Now, we've talked about this offline a fair amount, but just for the benefit of our audience, can you describe what is EWOC and what is some of the work that goes along with that? Because it really is something that it feels very old school to me. You know what I mean? It feels like something that is basically workers, people getting out there, empowering workers to organizing in their workplace and providing those tools that we mentioned earlier, providing some experience, providing guidance to build worker power.
Sure. Yeah. So EWOC is a project that was begun at the beginning of the pandemic. We founded it sort of by necessity, ad hoc. A lot of us had been labor organizers for the Bernie campaign, and all of a sudden, think about the early pandemic. You had so many workers were in crisis. Their companies were making them go in. They weren't giving them any PPE. They weren't giving any sort of hazard pay. And so workers started reaching out to the Bernie campaign, being like, can we get some support? And it was out of this sort of urgency and immediacy that we started connecting workers with experienced labor organizers. And EWOC was born out of that, but has since blossomed into a project that will support any worker in any industry in any region of the US take the first steps towards organizing their workplace, to building a union, to fighting for things like better wages. And so the process is very simple. If you're out there and you're like, oh yeah, my work sucks, or it could be better, I want to do something about it, but I don't know how to get started. All you do is you go to workerorganizing.org. That's the EWOC website, workerorganizing.org. And you'll see there's a button there that you can fill out a form that says, I get support. I want support to change my workplace. And what we'll do then is connect you within 72 hours to an experienced labor organizer who can call you up. We'll call you up to talk through the steps necessary to start organizing your coworkers. So that's essentially what EWOC is. It supports workers self-organizing at work for a union or for more immediate demands. And it does so by connecting them with experienced volunteer organizers across the country. Yeah, it's amazingly successful. We didn't expect it to catch on this much, but it really has, in part because it's been supported by Democratic Socialists of America, which is one of its sort of institutional partners, together with United Electrical Workers Union, which is sort of one of the most important left-wing unions in the country.
Yeah, and I can speak to an example of this. I live in Richmond, Virginia now, and there is a local botanical garden called the Lewis Ginter Botanical Garden, and they recently, I guess it was probably 2 or 3 months ago, it was like right before they have this big light up of their Christmas lights at the botanical garden. It's a really great thing. A lot of people in the community enjoy doing it. In the run up to that, and months prior, these folks, they got in touch with EWOC, like you mentioned. They began organizing on the job. They ended up getting sort of support also from the Machinist Union. And several months later, I believe it was this past November, they won their union. And it's one of those sorts of things that I was very, I helped a little bit of, talking to some of the workers in the run up to the election. And it's one of those things that I'm very proud to have been a part of. But that's just like one of countless case studies that of EWOC as a group building up and supporting workers in their workplace. So that's really something that I wanted to highlight.
That's cool. I hadn't realized you were involved in that. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, EWOC
I was a volunteer. I'm with the
you're connected to it. Yeah. I'm sure. Right. But in any case, yeah, what's one of the beautiful things about EWOC, especially, again, as we mentioned before, in this moment in history where it's easy to feel just sort of doom and gloom. One of the nice things about being involved in EWOC has been, you just hear all the time about workers winning, and you hear about workers building solidarity and sort of workers taking on the bosses and getting a sense of sort of meaning in life. I think labor organizing isn't just about the sort of dollars and cents, although that's part of it. It's also about building a community. It's also about sort of thinking about what it means to be alive. You know, what is our purpose here on this earth? Are we here just to like get by for ourselves? Or are we trying to make the world better for other people? And so that sense of higher purpose, I think, animates the labor movement at its best, but it certainly animates EWOC, you know, especially because so much of the organizing is done by volunteers, and it's supporting workers who aren't getting paid by anybody to organize. And so that ethos of, you know, changing the world through the bottom up is, I think, very inspiring. And there's just victory after victory like that. And I hope that will continue. So again, yeah, I would, you know, just make another case to any of your listeners. You know, do it now before you forget. Go to workerorganizing.org, and that changes, you know, it's a beautiful thing. And it's just really, it's an amazing thing to witness and to be part of. And so I would hope that everybody can have that opportunity.
Yeah, and you mentioned it as a counter to the doom and gloom that we keep, you know, bringing up over here, the sort of like powerlessness that people feel when they watch, you know, national television, see the state of national politics or whatever. It is like nothing can kind of like wake you up, you know, make you answer the bell, you know, more than people, you know, you yourself fighting for a union at your workplace, getting a contract, and getting real material benefits from that, real better pay, better insurance, job protections. Like that is I can't imagine any like more gratifying work that you can possibly do in your life than working for something and then reaping those benefits in this way.
Yeah, and you know, if the book had been 3 times longer, I would have included just maybe like 200 pages of stories about what it felt like for workers to win. It was really hard writing the book because I didn't include a lot of these stories. And
you got a part 2, I guess.
There's a lot of fun anecdotes in there about, you know, workers celebrating, popping the champagne bottle, you know, celebrating at karaoke, things like this. But I just love hearing these stories. I just, to me, is just the best thing, because there's just this sense of relief. There's this sense of changing the world. There's this sense that anything is possible, and power that is just so infectious. And you taste that once and you never want to let it go. And you sort of chase that high again in a good way, you know, like you keep on organizing, because when you feel that way, and when you see other people at work who are shy, who you didn't know before, or maybe even disagree with you, when you see them on board and feeling that way, there's nothing better on this planet, I think, than that sense of solidarity and power.
Yeah. And even like the path towards that victory, because I was in my previous job, I was actually in a union drive. Unfortunately, I got laid off in the midst of it. But even like every one of the steps along the way, oh, we're gonna do a button day, oh, we're going public, or whatever it is, you sort of see and feel a lot of that, you know, solidarity and camaraderie with the people that you're in that struggle with as it builds. So even before you get to the huge victory, you can see the possibilities and the sort of building expressions of that power that you have.
Yeah, 100%. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, the Starbucks workers campaign is still continuing so strong. They don't have a first contract yet, but not only have workers won concessions along the way. So oftentimes when you organize, the bosses will give you some concessions to try to prevent you from unionizing. Mm-hmm. And so that has a contradictory thing, because sometimes it can sort of maybe mollify some workers. But if you're organizing well, then actually that should give you and your coworkers more enthusiasm to say, look, they're being forced to listen to us. We're being effective. Mm-hmm. And along the way, then you get that sense of power and community, and it makes you continue to fight, you know, over what can be oftentimes, you know, frankly, a long slog. I don't think this is a type of organizing that is sort of like a quick fix, or that will even necessarily guarantee you victory in 100% of cases. Some of these campaigns lose. You know, we saw the Mercedes sort of plant of the auto
that
workers.
One got me. That one sucked.
Yeah, I mean, I was heartbroken. The workers were heartbroken. They lost, you know, earlier last year, they lost a union election 45%, 55%. But you know what? They're back at it. They're filing again. They're going to be organizing again, and there's a good chance that they could win this time around. And so the reality is, even when you lose a labor battle, the process of solidarity and empowerment that tends to come from the organizing itself is an extremely powerful sort of feeling and transformational process, which is why workers, even when they lose the union election or the bosses do horrible things, which they can do, workers say they never, you know, almost everyone I ever talked to says, I don't regret it. I would do it again in a heartbeat. because the change that I've felt and I've seen it happen amongst my coworkers is worth every single bit of the cost that we've been inflicted upon us.
Yeah, and also you, listener at home, you can also show public support for these sorts of things as well when they come out. And when you do that, the workers that are on the shop floor that are fighting for this, that are building their union and building worker power, they see it. When you fly Delta and you wear your AFA Delta pin, those flight attendants see that. When you show up to a picket line or you share a social media post from Starbucks workers, or if you talk to, I've been to several Starbucks picket lines and talked to a lot of those workers. They are so happy to see people from the community there to help them. And that is one of those sorts of things that, again, it's a shot in the arm for them. I know because I've been there, the shot in the arm for them, and it keeps building that effort as well. So listener, if there's a Starbucks strike happening, if there's a Starbucks actioning happening, if there's, anything like that from anybody that you can see that to plug yourself into, definitely take that opportunity. And it's definitely something that helps.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, solidarity, I think, is going to be crucial in these coming years, in part because the support that labor movement got in part from the last Biden administration through a good NLRB isn't going to be there. And so you're going to have to replicate some way of this extra additional support. And one way of building additional support for workers so that they're not fighting on their own is by an increase in community support. And so that has to be like not just posting online, although that's important, but it's showing up and it's taking action and taking civil disobedience if necessary. I actually think there's a lot of untapped potential still for the community to take far more sort of proactive role in supporting the labor movement.
Yeah. And again, this is in light of, that you see a lot of the Trump administration rhetoric is, again, destroying a lot of the official structures that are in place, like the NLRB. Like if there's no longer a process for arbitration, essentially, by these legal entities, you're going to have to essentially get a concession directly from your employer. And that's something that's not going to be able to be mediated by the government in the same way. So we need to be looking at getting contract strikes and not necessarily elections is my thought.
We'll see. It really remains to see what happened with the NLRB. It's possible this is just going to be like any other bad Republican administration in which you can still use the NLRB for its sort of limited impact, but it just know that it's going to be of limited use, but you can still go through it in part. It's possible that's still going to happen. I'm worried that people might throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. On the other hand, if they just like completely decimate it or overturn the Wagner Act and NLRA, then all bets are off, and anything could happen. And we should keep in mind that the labor movement did grow and sort of emerge as a force and eventually consolidate itself before it had legal rights by necessity. The only way it won legal rights is building power in the 1920s and before, culminating in the 1930s. But we have a lot of precedent of workers organizing even when the law was against them and winning, and then forcing through that way politicians to then sort of change the law to better reflect the balance of power on the ground.
Yeah. And you mentioned a couple of models already, but you alluded to digital tools a bit ago, and you mentioned Zoom specifically as one, or any kind of online communication for working across, from one shop talking to other shops and things like that, as a way to communicate outside of just the local, to sort of essentially get people on the same page, or at least sharing their experiences, et cetera, et cetera. What are some other digital tools that you sort of lay out that are ones that have shown to be successful in building up this, organizing projects?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that by way of sort of introducing it, it's worth flagging the broader question, which is that the reason that digital tools are so important is essentially that they lower organizing costs. They lower the cost of organizing. And so what that means is that rank and file workers can take on things that they couldn't have taken on before. So for instance, like in the past, if you're living in Buffalo, New York, and a worker reaches out like by letter or even by calling in Mesa, Arizona, well, basically your only opportunity to have like a real sustained organizing relationship with this person is you have to fly out a staffer to meet with them, right? Because you don't have another mechanism to have like a group call or to do like sustained face-to-face
prohibitively expensive.
Just prohibitively expensive. So you needed a staffer to send them out, right? So you couldn't have done that as a worker before. You needed to rely on the union to do that, the existing union structure. Now, because essentially communication costs are lowered, workers can do this. And so similarly on other things, like, well, in the past, you needed a lot of resources to print flyers and maybe distribute a newspaper and to send it out and to print everything out. Today, if you're able to do that for free over social media or via email, then workers are able to communicate and have often very powerful modes of communication without having to rely, again, as much on existing union structures. So Starbucks Workers United, for instance, had the most successful TikTok presence of any union ever. They've gotten hundreds of millions of views. And this was rank and file workers creating videos about their working conditions and sort of talking in the idiom of TikTok, which as a older millennial, I don't understand, but I understand it's important, and it worked. And so again, the point here being that part of the reason we're seeing worker to worker organizing take off isn't just sort of like the economic crisis and the sort of youth radicalization and the good NLRB and the pandemic. These are all important sort of short-term factors or some more long-term factors. But part of it, and this is part of the reason why I would expect that this type of worker-to-worker organizing will continue, even under Trump, even if momentum is a little bit lower, although we'll see, is basically just that the whole organizing terrain has been radically shifted by this drop in organizing costs. And that can have a negative impact because sometimes it's easier just like to call for a general strike online than have to like it's easier to feel like you're making a change by just calling for things online without doing the hard work of organizing. And so the argument I make in the book is that these types of digital tools are crucial, but they can be misused, right? It's possible to use digital tools in a way that just leads you to speak essentially to the echo chamber, right? You're only talking to people who already agree with you. Preaching to the choir. Because it's cheaper to do that, it's also easier just to talk with the people who already agree with you. And so the ways that you can use digital tools to actually organize, but by which I mean like persuade people who don't agree with you, build new structures, is things like I mentioned, digital Zoom to talk with workers at your company elsewhere. But it can be something as simple as like set up a group chat, set up a group text with your coworkers in which you can like talk smack about the boss, in which you can maybe say, hey, you drop in a link, be like, hey, did you see these workers at Starbucks? They won a big raise because they demanded it. Maybe we could do something similar. So something as simple as like setting up a group chat with your coworkers to vent is something that a lot of drives have used. Something like organizing a social media presence. If you want to put pressure on your bosses and you don't have a lot of resources, well, you can set up a TikTok, you can set up an Instagram, you can go on Twitter, X, whatever, and you can expose the bad conditions. You don't have to wait for a union to do that. It's good if a union will support you, and it's good to have more resources, but you don't have to wait. And you're the best position as a worker to expose what's actually going on at work and to generate public support and to put pressure on your bosses to listen to your demands.
Yeah, and the group chat thing is like becoming at this point almost like a step one. Like you want to get all your fives together, you want to put them in the group chat, and then you start looking at who are the next people you're going to talk to, what is the next action that you're going to do, how are you going to distribute buttons, whatever it is that the mechanics of what you're doing it is, that has to happen. And it can be, I mean, again, group chats are 24/7. Like this communication can be happening all the time, officially not during work hours. Yeah, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more. But like, it's one of those sorts of things where you can basically have an ongoing conversation with your leaders all the time, and that's something that's never been possible before.
Yeah, and I think chats are really important for coordinating, essentially, exactly as you mentioned, amongst sort of the folks who are putting in time on the campaign. I don't think that digital is so great for persuading the skeptics, and for that, if ideally you want an in-person conversation,
one-on-ones, one-on-ones, you can never technology your way out of that one,
right? But for coordinating amongst people who are already on board, it's just tremendously useful, And again, it goes to the question of lowered organizing costs. It makes a difference for workers to self-organize when you can do a chat and you don't have to have money to rent out a hall. It's great if you can have a hall, but if you don't, you can still coordinate, and that's a game changer, and it's something I think that maybe the union movement hasn't fully absorbed in its potentialities yet.
Especially considering, like you mentioned the News Guild, and you mentioned some of these journalism workspaces or work sort of like environments. A lot of times you'll have people all over the place, and it would be impossible essentially to get an entire unit in the same room at the same time without those digital tools because of the nature of that work. And really with the sort of like rise, especially since the pandemic, of remote work and online, workspaces, in order to organize those kinds of people who you might have somebody in Portland, Oregon, Tampa, Florida, Indianapolis, and New York, in order to get all those people on the same page, what are you going to, have everybody fly into Chicago and meet together? Like you need, it's a necessity in certain situations to use these kinds of tools to have these kinds of conversations with your coworkers because of the nature of those work environments.
Yeah, that's right.
So in the last couple of minutes, I really did want to sort of like pick your brain on, your thoughts of, we mentioned again over and over again this doom and gloom situation, and this sort of like, we're really at the beginning of this sort of like Trump era or whatever it is, part 2. What you mentioned that the your faith and mine are both in workers, building and working our way to endure forward. But like in the sort of like next couple of years, what do you see as sort of definable, victory points or, benchmarks to if we hit this, by 2025 or whatever, we're doing well? Just in your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that part of it is winning the defensive battles. So I'll talk more about going on the offense after. But I think part of it is winning these defensive battles, and in part through worker organizing on a large scale. So to give an example, Trump has floated the idea of privatizing the postal service. Okay, so if Trump actually goes forward with this, and it's and other attacks on federal government workers have already begun. This is going to be a huge crisis point, but it's also an opportunity for the labor movement to just raise the flag of working people against an administration. And can the labor movement rise to the task, not only to sort of just like write a letter to your legislators, but to actually have, in this case, for instance, postal workers, talk with all the people on their route, talk with the neighbors and say, hey, we need your support. Can you come out to this rally tomorrow? Can you pledge that you're going to support us in our action, right? This type of sort of bottom-up organizing in which workers take the lead is going to be crucial for defeating Trump's worst attacks, including on whether it's immigrant rights, how are we going to support at scale, our sort of undocumented brothers and sisters who are getting attacked. I would hope that this would take a lot of labor action that is not just sort of already getting the committed activists on board, but is trying to get working people as a whole to understand that when they're attacking undocumented immigrants, they're attacking all working people, right? So this is part of it, winning those battles. On the offensive front, the reality is the labor movement has a huge amount of money at its disposal that it's not using. We're talking about over $30 billion in net assets that the labor movement is currently sitting on. And even a small portion of that could be used for massively scaling up new organizing, right? It's possible that that's going to take a form that's not going to be primarily through the NLRB, remains to be seen about that. But the reality is working people are fed up. That's part of the reason why Trump got elected. And there's this crisis in our country that no other force can fill, I think, other than the labor movement. So the labor movement has a responsibility to not only sort of hunker down and try to beat back the worst of the attacks of the Trump administration, but to put itself forward as the voice for, working people of all backgrounds, of all races, and say, look, working people are getting hammered hard by the system right now. We're faced with a tremendous amount of insecurity. The bosses need to pay up. We're going to help organize any working person to make sure that everybody has a life of dignity, that you have a voice at work, and that your kids can prosper. And so what the labor movement can do very concretely is put significant more money towards new organizing. The ideal would be something like 30% of its budgets towards new organizing, and to scale up and support existing campaigns, whether it's Starbucks Workers United, whether the auto workers are continuing to do very ambitious new organizing. I know the Teamsters are doing very ambitious organizing, supporting at Amazon. So those campaigns need to be supported financially, materially, and scaled up. But we also need to find ways to talk to all of these other working people who aren't yet on board and say, we hear you. This is a step you can take tomorrow to fight back. Whether it's just the labor movement saying you deserve a raise, we're going to help you fight to win a raise, right? There's a lot of mechanisms that the labor movement could do. And so what I would like to see, what I think a realistic sort of benchmark would be for the next 4 years, would be for the labor movement to at least sustain its current level of momentum. I don't know if you're going to reverse, union density decline under Trump. That might be hard. But I think what you can do is wage a lot wider battles. You can involve much higher numbers of working people, and you can train up tens of thousands of new worker leaders who are going to be the people fighting and winning concessions over the next 4 years, keeping labor movement and the labor struggle sort of in the press, but actually making it even more of the headline news, making the axis on which politicians are judged is, are you supporting the labor movement? Or are you supporting the bosses? To me, it is possible and it's necessary to wage those kind of big high profile battles over the next 4 years. And it's going to be that type of ability to sort of polarize around class lines, around economic demands, around bosses versus workers. That's going to set the basis, I think, for defeating Trumpism. It's going to undermine this sham populism, and it's going to set that sort of type of political realignment that could force the Democrats to, to meet the demands of working people. It could expose the Republicans and force all the politicians who aren't actually on the side of working people out there. And so that is the type of ambitious organizing that's possible, but it's going to require a lot of work from below because a lot of unions, unfortunately, are still pretty risk averse.
All right. His name is Eric Blanc. The book is We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big. Eric, where can people find you and where can people find your book?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks again, Jeff, for having me on. The best way to follow my writings is to just sign up for my Substack newsletter, which is laborpolitics.com. So you just go there, and that's where I put my writings. So I would sign up there. The book, if you just Google like Eric Blanc, We Are the Union, it'll pop up. You can sort of buy it anywhere you would normally buy books. Right now it's pre-order. The actual copies, the release date is February 18th, but you can pre-order it now. And so I would, encourage anyone to do that. And if you reach out and you're in a union or an organization, we're also providing like pretty big discounts for if you're in a union, or DSA is actually organizing together with EWOC and Organizing for Power, a national study group of the book. So if you look me up on social media, maybe the best way to do it, you'll see that there's a national study group of the book, and you can get a 50% discount. So just look at me up at any of those places, get a copy of the book, and get organized. Reach out to EWOC if you want to help organize your workplace.
Cool. Eric, thank you as always. We have to have you on again soon. Hopefully it's less than 5 years before we have you on again.
Thanks again, Jeff.
Thanks everybody for listening. This has been Good Morning Comrade. You are listening to WHIV-LP New Orleans 102.3. We love you. Bye-bye.